Is this going through? Mic is too high. Oh, that would do it. It slipped earlier, I apologize. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. Since October 7th, our hearts have been broken. And just when we think we might find a measure of healing, something else has occurred and we find ourselves shattered into 1,000 pieces again. Today, it's Yom Kippur, a day where we tell our stories, we remember our martyrs and our sacred dead, and also we look for a measure of wholeness and hope in the year to come. So I'd like to take some time to remember some of what's happened to us, the tragedies of this year. I'd also like to look towards some wholeness and some hope. I don't intend to talk at all about the military or political situation in any direct way. I don't feel like that's the place for Yom Kippur, and so we can do that in another setting, but rather the spiritual and emotional challenges that this year has presented us. So I want to begin by thinking a little bit about some of the testimonies of that horrific day itself of October 7th. Some of you may know that now online there are eyewitness testimonies that have been recorded of Israelis and others, and a little bit of what happened to them on that day. I found one of those collections and translated a little bit from this woman named Shira Moss. She was a 19-year-old Nova Festival attendee. This is my translation, so any errors are my own. She says, everything was normal. Lots of shalom. She says shlomim. This one to that. It was just fun. Nothing more complicated. Then the music stopped, and we were shocked. Why had it stopped? We didn't understand. Then we heard 2 explosions, shtei boomim, she says. Not like usual with the alarm and 30 seconds to get to our shelter. We heard more rockets, and we were evacuated to our cars. Luckily, I was one of the first to get out, so I didn't get stuck in traffic. I reached out by phone to my Abba and my older brother, and my brother laughed and said, "Oh, what a fun story this is going to be." Shira describes how she drove for a little bit and then got stuck behind a barrier and exited her car. She said, "We thought in just a minute the police will come and it will be okay. We had no idea there were thousands coming to shoot us. We ran for quite some time. I thought I was going to die. And then just stopped worrying. Everything went out of my head and my body just kept running. I hid under a tree for 7 hours. It barely covered us. I then saw an Arab coming toward me and I didn't even get up to run. I just thought I was going to die. But it wasn't a terrorist. It was a Bedouin. He took some of us in his car, drove us to a neighboring town where we were able to return home." Shira was one of the lucky ones. She survived and, though traumatized, emerged whole in body. But as we know, 1,200 people were murdered, raped, and brutalized on that day. Hundreds more were injured in deep ways, both physically and emotionally. And just when we thought somehow maybe we could find a way to bear that, it triggered an explosion of anti-Semitism, the likes of which we had not seen before in the United States. And as we take stock on the past year, we've seen many reports coming out. One from Stanford, looking back at anti-Semitism on campus, is filled with horrific details and anecdotes. Among them, that there were a number of parties where Jews, or people who looked Jewish, frankly, would go to ask for admittance to a party, and they were told that only if they said, "Fuck Israel," would they be admitted into that party. I don't understand how we ended up at a time where only the right kind of Jews get to socialize with people. Or on the University of Michigan campus, where 3 Jews already this term have been attacked, selected only because they were Jews, and where now on campus they've begun to organize a kind of shmirah where people can be walked across campus with some modicum of security. I don't understand how we ended up suddenly in the United States where simply looking Jewish was dangerous. We also have begun to read about accounts of some of our soldiers, of the people who have been dedicating themselves to keep Israel and the Jewish people safe. You may not know, but there's actually a custom in the army that before people go into combat, they write letters before they go. And I'd like to read you one such letter. This is from Sergeant First Class Ben Zussman. He writes, I'm writing you this message on my way to the base. If you're reading this, something probably happened to me. As you know me, I'm likely the happiest person right now. It's not for nothing that I was about to fulfill my dream. I'm happy and grateful for the privilege I'll have to defend our beautiful country and the people of Israel. Even if something happens to me, I don't allow you to sink into sadness. I had the privilege to fulfill my dream and destiny, and be sure that I'm looking down at you from above with a huge smile. I'll probably sit next to Grandpa and catch up, each of us sharing our experiences and how things have changed between the wars. Maybe we'll talk some politics. I'll ask him what he thinks. If God forbid you're sitting Shiva, turn it into a week of friends, family, and fun. Have food, meat, of course, beers, sweet drinks, seeds, tea, and definitely mom's cookies. Laugh, listen to stories, meet all my other friends you haven't met yet. You know, I'm jealous of you. I'd like to sit there and see everyone. Another very, very important point. If, God forbid, I fall into captivity, alive or dead, I'm not willing for a single soldier or civilian to be harmed because of some deal for my release. I don't allow you to run a campaign or struggle or anything like that. I'm not willing for terrorists to be released in exchange for me in no way, shape, or deal. Please don't violate my words. I'll say it again. I left home without even being called up for reserve duty. I'm full of pride and a sense of mission, and I've always said that if I need to die, I hope it will be in defense of others and the country. Jerusalem, I have set watchmen. May the day come when I'll be one of them. Ben Zussman died in Gaza at the beginning of December. Yehi zichrona livracha, may his memory be for a blessing. And part of what we love about Israel and the Jewish people are stories like these of such great courage and confidence and love. And we love that Israel is a place of pluralism and democracy where the rights of all are honored. And so we have to have the courage to admit that our hearts break when we read stories of Israeli bigotry also in this last year. Some of you may know that there are Israeli soldiers who have been charged with brutalizing Palestinian prisoners of war. And as upsetting as that is, I'm even more heartbroken to have learned that then hundreds of Israelis, including a minister of the government, showed up to protest their arrest, to try to stop the military police from carrying out their judgments and justice and enforcing Israel's code of ethic, and rather to try to get in their way. Our hearts break when we read and hear of such bigotry. And when we hear other stories of heroism and compassion, our hearts similarly break. Some of you may know of Yotam Chaim. He was a hostage killed in a friendly fire incident. And he was invited over, or rather Iris, his mother, invited the soldiers who killed him to her home. And she said, quote, that she invited them, quote, to hug you and tell you that what you did, however sad, was apparently the right thing at the moment. We love you very much, and that is all. And our hearts broke about 6 weeks ago when we learned of the deaths of Hirsch Polin, Eden Yerushalmi, Carmel Gat, Almog Sarosi, Alexander Lobanov, and Ori Daninu, perhaps hours from being rescued, were brutally murdered by Hamas and left in tunnels underneath Rafiah for soldiers to recover. May their memories also be for a blessing. It is Yom Kippur. It's a day to remember our sacred dead and the traumas that have affected us. And we read on this day, Acharei Mot, a story that recalls the death of Aaron's two sons. When those sons died, Moses came to give him the news, Vayidom Aharon. Aaron couldn't find any words to deal with or express the tragic loss that he had experienced. And so we also find ourselves searching for words and explanations to try to make some sense of this horrific year. Israelis, too, are looking for the words, and sometimes have found them in poetry and song. And so I'd like to read to you a couple of poems from Israeli authors over this past year. The first is by a poet named Itai Lev. It's called Mom is Always Right, and it's translated by Heather Silverman. Heather's sitting somewhere over here. Translated by our own Heather Silverman, Michael Bonin, and Rachel Korazim. Mom said that when I grew up, there would be no army. Mom was right. I haven't yet grown up, and already there was no army. It wasn't there when I heard the screaming outside. It wasn't there when I saw Dad so scared and stressed. It wasn't there when the door was kicked in. It wasn't there when I hid under the bed. It wasn't there when we three pushed back on the door of the safe room. It wasn't there when time just stood still. It wasn't there when they suddenly entered. It wasn't there when they tore Dad off Mom. Mom had always said that when I grew up, there would be no army. Mom was right. Now all I want is to tell her that she is always right. I cried, I screamed, and still she is silent. Lev is trying to capture some of the experience of that day through the eyes of a child who maybe at some point told his mother that he was afraid of serving in the military, of how scary it was to imagine that adult responsibility. And his mother told him, as generations of Israelis has told their children, by the time you grow up, there will be no army because we'll be at peace with our neighbors. We won't need an army. And Lev turns that promise into a horrific opposite. There was no army because for hours and even a day and a half, the Israeli army didn't show up in meaningful numbers. It took almost 2 days to restore the border with Gaza. And in that time, Israelis and American Jews and Jews worldwide who thought the military could keep us safe realized the extremity of our situation and realized how vulnerable we still are. And also Israelis realized that the government also didn't show up in the ways that they would have expected or hoped. In those first 6 weeks after the catastrophe, refugees were from south of Gaza, from the Gaza envelope, the area right next to Gaza, found themselves often without supplies or food. And ordinary Israelis stood up and made sure that they had winter coats, that they had places to stay, that they had meals, that there was education for their children, and song and dance for them to bring some joy back into their lives. Asaf Gur, another Israeli poet, takes it even a step further to imagine a kind of loss of faith in God. In his poem Kaddish, he writes, Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. And no one came. Many thousands called to him on Shabbat morning, crying his name out loud, tearfully begging him just to come, but he had ceased from all his work. Gur turns around the liturgy of Shabbat. Remember, October 7th was Shmini Atzeret, but it was also Shabbat. And we read these words from Genesis, God ceased from all his work and rested on the Shabbat. But again, it becomes a horrific opposite. God ceased from all God's work and left us alone when we needed divine providence and protection the most. It is Yom Kippur. We're remembering our tragedies and our loss and trying somehow to find some meaning and wholeness and hope amid our brokenness. You know, I'd always thought we read the words of Acharei Mot telling of the story of Aaron's life in order to create room in this place for those of us who had experienced tragedies and difficulties in the previous year. People who had received that awful phone call or the terrible diagnosis, whose relationships had finally fallen apart or had even, God forbid, lost children. And by telling that story, it was to invite everyone with their tragedies to come join us and to be comforted. But this year I've learned that we read those words because sometimes we experience national tragedy. We are all heartbroken. There is no one left to comfort us, and we just need each other somehow desperately to gather together. And in such a moment, we look for words and ways of making sense. We sometimes turn to frustration and anger. Sometimes we limit when we should expand. Sometimes we try to assert illusions of control that we just don't have. I had dinner with a dear friend a few months ago who hadn't come to Kol Hamet Shabbat services since October 7th. And he told me the reason that he hadn't been here was because he was afraid that his views on the war and some criticisms he had of how the government of Israel was acting would not be welcome in this space. And so he didn't come rather than find conflict or difficulty around his experience of Shabbat. Or a discussion I had at Kiddush a little bit later of someone thinking about whether they would go on the women's retreat, who had experienced such anti-Semitism and anti-Israel vitriol at work, could not imagine going on a retreat where there might be some with criticisms of the state or government of Israel, and wasn't sure if she could go. I worry that in this moment of pain and loss, we are shrinking the margins, the edges of our community. We're turning people away precisely when they need us the most. When we should be making room, our edges are disappearing. I want us to believe that we can do better. And look, we aren't ready to turn on our family and friends and community. Hamas would like us divided. Hezbollah loves it when we're at each other's throats. But Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel and the Jewish people, isn't limited to those with whom we agree. It is a much broader notion to build community and connection within and among the Jewish people. I'm not willing to engage with leaders of organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace with their hateful anti-Israel and anti-Zionist vitriol, but the people, the children of our congregants who perhaps go to their events or read their materials, I'm not ready to turn away from them either, because I've spent too much of my life loving them to change my habits now. We need a better answer. We need an answer that creates more room for what it means to be pro-Israel. To realize that Ahavat Yisrael, love of the Jewish people and of Israel, is a broad notion that we need now more than ever. I have done many things this year to try to stand up for and support Israel, but to me, the most meaningful actions were 2 phone calls. I called my cousin Sippy when her son Lev had been stuck in Sweden. He had gone to go visit his father. It was an ugly divorce. I don't want to tell the whole story. He'd gone to go visit his father in Sweden, and it was one of these air traffic disruptions. He got stuck, and it ended up being a 30-hour flight to return home with multiple stops for a 9-year-old. So she was stressed and concerned and worried, and we just talked on the phone, and I told her it was going to be okay, and we laughed and talked about an upcoming trip. Or I called my friend Josh after he'd been stuck in a bomb shelter for an hour with Iranian ballistic missiles going overhead. And we talked and we laughed and we joked. He said, the missiles were there only to ruin Rosh Hashanah. They were trying to mess with the gefilte fish that I was making in my kitchen. Ahavat Yisrael means love not just of the nation but of its people, and to try to find ways of expressing our love and our compassion for one another, because amid this brokenness we need that love more than ever. And we have to start looking for our allies and friends in the wider world. It's easy to see our enemies. They are making a lot of noise and they're very visible. But it's a tragedy when we miss our friends. For example, the City Council of Palo Alto has been a great friend to us over this year. They've made a decision that the council has no business in international affairs. They've stayed out of calls for unilateral ceasefires. And instead, they've worked hard to ensure security and peace here in Palo Alto for all the residents of the city. There are police officers who cruise by us over this high holidays to make sure our facility is safe. We have friends like AME Zion Church. AME Zion is one of the historically black denominations in the United States. They have not always been the most pro-Israel of institutions. But something changed for them on October 7th. In the writings that they've offered to the world about that tragedy, they have criticized Israel's military. They have used language about the situation in Gaza that I reject and wouldn't use myself. And they unequivocally condemned Hamas, its violence, bloodshed, and rapes. They unequivocally said that Hamas can have no part in the government of a restored Gaza. They acknowledged the pain and loss of Israelis and others on that horrific day. And they noticed the need for a Jewish state in the land of our ancestors. They are our friends and allies, and we need to notice and see them. We need an answer that takes seriously an ethical Zionism, that is proud of a state of Israel and in love with that state and its place and its people, in part because it is a place of democracy and pluralism. It is a nation that pursues peace even when all hope for peace seems lost. We need to find for ourselves a new wholeness amid all of this tragedy and trauma that can somehow help us restore ourselves to Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel and the Jewish people, and can restore us to pursuers and lovers of peace. We want to make real the anthem, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live and thrive. I was surprised to learn this year, I'd always thought Am Yisrael Chai, that phrase, goes back to time immemorial. It actually dates from the 1960s. It was written for the Soviet Jewry struggle, and it was meant to call back to the story of Joseph reuniting with his brothers. Remember, he had been separated from them for 20 years. And when they were reunited, in this moment of tear and hugs, he said, Od Avinu Chai, is our father Jacob still alive? And so they picked up on this moment, and they said, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live, V'od Avinu Chai, and our father Jacob lives as well. We may be separated from our Soviet brethren, but we will be reconnected. There may be a moment of tragedy in the Jewish people, but we have the strength to persist and bring them back to Israel and the United States and free them from decades of oppression. And we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, by the way. And that anthem, Am Yisrael Chai, Od Avinu Chai, the Jewish people live and our father Jacob still lives, has remained an anthem of hope at difficult times, and all the more so in this past year. And it seems a particularly necessary story because Jacob is the patriarch referred to as whole, even though he is the one with a visible deformity. He had a limp left over from his fight with the angel. I feel like Jacob discovered wholeness because he couldn't hide or make invisible his pain or trauma. It was visible for everyone to see. So he had no choice but to incorporate it into a new wholeness that would let him be a patriarch who could give birth to the whole Jewish people. We similarly need to find a path amid our trauma and loss to discover a true and new wholeness that will allow us to remain committed to Ahavat Yisrael, to love of Israel and the Jewish people, and to be lovers and pursuers of peace. Because when we say Am Yisrael Chai, we mean that even in this darkness and violence and bloodshed and terror, we will still survive and thrive. Say it after me. Am Yisrael Chai. Carol warned me that that would happen. And when we say Am Yisrael Chai, we mean that we will find ways of expressing Ahavat Yisrael, our love for Israel and the Jewish people. It may include advocating for causes in which we believe. It may include supporting Israelis directly. And it may just mean phone calls to our friends and family because, and say it with me, Am Yisrael Chai. And we will find a way when we say Am Yisrael Chai to show that we are a people who can balance strength with compassion, that our enemies want us to be like them, but we are better than that because Am Yisrael Chai. And my friends, when we say Am Yisrael Chai, we mean that we will get through this tragedy and pain and loss. We will uncover a new light of redemption from amid the darkness so that every Israeli, and yes, any Palestinian willing to accept a hand lifted up in peace will discover a new era because, and let's say it together, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai.